Ian Whittaker. I'm the Director of Strategic Content at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome to everyone watching online. Before we begin today, please know we're on the record. We're live streaming this event on our website and our social media channels. We welcome your social media engagement, but please silence your phones before we begin. Please also know that the views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and then do not represent institutional views or positions of the Chicago Council. After the presentation, I will moderate Q&A, and you can submit a question by typing ccga.live into your browser, or you can just raise your hand. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Abhijit Banerjee is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, along with Esther Duflo, also of MIT, and Michael Kramer of Harvard. Abhijit was awarded the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in October. Congratulations. In 2003, he co-founded the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and he remains one of the lab's directors. And along with Esther Duflo, he's the author of Good Economics for Hard Times, available for sale and signing after the program from our partners at the Bookseller, which tonight is at the back of the room. Abhijit will be in conversation with Raghuram Rajan. Raghuram is the Catherine Dusak Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School. From 2013 to 2016, he was the 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. He is the author of numerous books, most recently The Third Pillar, How Markets and the State Leave Communities Behind, which was released earlier this year. And Raghuram is a board director of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professors Banerjee and Rajan to the Chicago Council.
Thanks very much, and welcome everyone. So, Abhijit, can you tell us a little bit about growing up in India and how you got interested in economics?
You know, I wish I had a really, one of these heart-wrenching stories or something. In fact, my parents are both economists. I tried to not be an economist. I tried to study math, but I found the whole place where I was studying math incredibly boring. And I decided I want to do something else. And in India, everything has to be planned ahead if you want to get ahead in life. Like Raghu, you want to go to the Indian Institute of Technology, which is where really everybody wants to go to. Then you plan a year ahead, you take exams, etc. So I was late at that party, so I had no choice. So, it was like, you could do nothing or you could do economics. So I did economics and somehow got stuck.
Okay, so in this illustrious economics career that you lapsed into, there's rumors that you were arrested. What was that for?
Really, for being a part of a student protest, I think.
What were you protesting?
It's a good question. I don't remember. It looks good on my CV. I spent 10 days in India's maximum security prison.
Tihar?
Tihar.
Okay.
So it's something you can kind of wear as a badge of courage, I guess. But I actually was neither brave nor particularly committed to this exercise. It just happened.
Well, what was prison like?
Kind of like a low-end country club. We played volleyball a lot. It was very hot. There was no fans, so it was like and it was in May in Delhi, so it was however many degrees it was, so it was warm. On the other hand, there was a bunch of us young men. And there was a quadrangle, and there was volleyball. So I spent a lot of time. As you know, I like playing sports. So I spent a lot of time playing volleyball.
Well, that sounds like fun. Well, you just got the Nobel Prize. I guess you couldn't have asked for a better coming out party for your book. What did you get the Nobel Prize for?
For the experimental approach or something like that. I don't remember the words.
Okay. Well, can you explain to our audience what...
So what we do, this is what this organization we founded many years ago sponsors and encourages is randomized controlled trials, so large-scale trials or social programs where instead of kind of going by your hunches or some theory of what must work, we actually test them out. And I think that has had a substantial impact in the way people now think about policy, because essentially lots of things we thought were true are not true, and some things we thought were not true are true. And it turns out that as a result, sometimes we were making policy kind of without knowing what we were doing. And it's a little less true now, not enough, but I think there is a sense in which we've now about 1,000 large-scale randomized control trials. Large-scale I emphasize because you might imagine medical trials. These are like medical trials. When medical trials have 50 or 100 people, these have 50,000 or million people. They're just different kind of social experiment, and they have their own challenges, which are very different from what you would do in a lab or in a medical trial. So it's a very powerful tool sometimes for finding answers to questions we don't know, and we have I think 200 affiliates or professors at places like the University of Chicago who do these randomized controlled trials, and we get to take the credit for all of those. So that's how.
So what are a couple of big learnings from these trials? So
one that I was involved in and got much abuse for was microcredit. In the early 2000s, I think people were pretty convinced that microcredit was the answer. I don't know exactly what the question was, but it was the answer. And then it turned out that it wasn't the answer, again, to at least some questions. In other words, it didn't make people richer. It might have done many good things. I am in favor of people getting credit, but they were not using the credit to make themselves richer. They were making themselves buying refrigerators or televisions, and I'm sure that was contributing to the welfare. But the basic idea that somehow every person is sort of a potential entrepreneur and that they will just take this money and run did turn out not to be true. So we ended up with relatively clear, precise answer to that question, which is that, and then that was replicated many times in many countries, and always find the same answer, which is that on the median person, there isn't really much of an effect on their well-being. So that was a negative, but of course, and quite unpopular answer, but it eventually permeated. And if the rhetoric of microcredit organizations has moved in, I think, in a much more constructive direction, which is to emphasize that they do something useful, get credit to people who need them. If they use it to buy a refrigerator, that's still good, because they need a refrigerator. And I think, and then I think we have learned a lot more about who are the potential entrepreneurs and how you could actually target credit to them and things like that. But I think there was this kind of this Pollyanna view that there are, every entrepreneurs around every corner, and we didn't find that.
Absolutely. There was this sense, the cell phone lady phenomenon.
Yes.
That somehow everybody could set up as cell phone ladies, buy a cell phone and rent it out to their friends and relatives and make money. It turns out once you had a few of them, there were no more rents in this business. And interestingly, as you said, one of the concerns about microfinance was that in this hope of getting richer, people were getting overly indebted. And I think trying to come to terms with what it could do and what it couldn't was important. So you have this new book, Good Economics for Hard Times. Why did you write it?
I think we wrote it mostly because we were scared. I must say, I find the world extremely scary these days. I feel that, in particular, I think people like you and I, we are completely marginal to the public conversation. In the 1960s, every week, Newsweek, which used to be a prominent publication, used to have either Milton Friedman from the conservative side or Paul Samuelson from the liberal side write a column, and everybody read those things. These days, I think there's no economist who has anything like that credible.
Paul Krugman?
No. I think even Paul Krugman, who I admire enormously, kind of plays to the converted. I think there isn't a real, and the numbers, we did a survey of 10,000 people in the US, almost representative, you can't get fully representative in online surveys since then. Some people are not online. And we find that we ask them the question, do you trust such and such profession for what they say about their own area of competence? So if you ask a weatherman about the weather, do you trust the answer? The answer is 50-50. You ask a nurse about her competence, 85% say we trust her. You ask about the same question an economist, 25% say they trust an economist. And the only people who are below economists, you can guess, are politicians. So it's a deeply kind of depressing time to be an economist, because in some ways...
That's why they call us political economists, right?
Yes, exactly.
But tell me, a deeply depressing time, but if you look around, you find unemployment across the industrial world is at historical lows, at least decadal lows, if not historical. And the S&P 500 is touching records every day. So where are the hard times?
Well, even with that, wage growth has been very slow. And we don't actually understand why wage growth is so slow and why inflation is so low. This is sort of everybody scratching their head about it. And basically, for some reason, the presumption and this is part of our problem as a profession. We predict so many things that don't turn out to be true. This was the moment when inflation was supposed to be charging through. It's not charging. So we don't know why wage growth is slow. But basically, we've had 40 years of no or very little wage growth. To me, I actually don't care about the GDP. Conditional on most people not benefiting, whether GDP is growing or not is not of great interest to me. I think GDP is great if that serves the interests of people. But I think that without that particular quota, I don't think there is any particular reason to talk about, the fact that the stock market is high, or if this is turning into welfare, then yes. If not, God knows what it means. And you are of course one of the people who've been warning the world for many years about the dangers of bubbles and all those things. So I don't know that I have to persuade you that this is a little bit of a red herring.
Yeah. No, so I think that you talk about the various ills that could emerge in the world. Let's get to some of those. This is a fantastic book about the big issues of the day and what economists have to say about these issues. So let's take some of those issues and walk through what you say about them. Start first with migration or immigration more generally. What's your sense of it? What should people take away? What do we know, and what don't we know?
Well, I think most strikingly on migration, actually, what we know is, I think, extremely sharply at odds with what I think most people seem to assume. So I think there are two facts about migration, both of which I think are missed. One is that there's no evidence, or I think the National Academy of Science actually did a review of the evidence and kind of came up with the bottom line. The bottom line is that low-skill migration has no effects or no negative effects on the wages of low-skilled natives. So there is no evidence that when lots of people show up with low skills, that depresses the wages of other low-skilled people. The second fact, which is maybe even less recognized, is that what's striking is how few people migrate. I mean, during the Greek crisis, some groups had unemployment rates of 60%. They could all have gone to Germany. Within the EU, you can go anywhere you want. 60,000 Greeks migrated over that whole period. Just essentially, most striking fact is people don't migrate. That's also true within the US. In fact, within the US, 7% used to move across county boundaries every year in the 1950s. That number is now 4%. If migration in movement is actually in pursuit of economic betterment, has gone down in the US as well. So it's not that, Tocqueville wrote about, how mobile Americans are in every sense of the word. And in every sense of the word, Americans are much less mobile now. So I think if anything, we should start worrying about why people are not moving. I think migration, both internal and external, the Greek example is external, the US is internal, and I think we should also ask the question, what's stopping people from moving? After all, you hear these narratives about these absolute disaster areas, in the Appalachia, where factories have closed, where mines have closed. The presumption of most economics is that the people will leave. They'll vote with their feet and that'll take care of the problem. And the reason why the problem has festered so much is precisely that they don't leave, that they stayed in place. And if you lost your job and you stay in place, then what happens is that town now is full of people who have really no way of supporting themselves. That means all the amenities collapse. So, all these services, there's no one to buy in the restaurants, so there are no restaurants. And so all the amenities collapse and the whole economy goes into a tailspin. And that particular tailspin is a result of the fact that people are moving. And
are not moving.
Are not moving.
Yeah. No, so let's get back to this fact that place matters increasingly and what we can do about it in just a bit. But you have a very nice example, the Mariel boat lift, and you talk about the various economic studies that have been done about it. What does one learn from that?
Well, I think the Mariel boat lift was a moment when Castro decided to let a bunch of Cubans leave. They all went to Miami. There was a large increase in the population of low-skilled Hispanic residents in Miami. David Card was the first economist, many others have done it since, looked at what's the impact of that on the wages of other Spanish-speaking migrants and non-Spanish-speaking migrants in Miami, and found nothing, and no impact. And since then, there have been many studies of many such episodes, and typically they find nothing. Sometimes they actually find positive, sometimes negative. But really, the bottom line on it is that none of these studies find strong negative effects. And I think that that's something that people at first blush seem surprising. And I feel that that's one of the reasons why we haven't been able to persuade anybody of it, is that we often, as economists, we don't provide kind of enough of the explanation for these facts. We say, oh yeah, it's that way, and then people think that can't make sense, so they don't believe it. And I think the reason why it actually makes sense is, partly low-skilled migrants are both a source of labor supply, more workers, but also demand. These people don't just, eat air. they spend money. They work, they generate money, and they spend it. And I think the first order effect is therefore those two things cancel out. And it's also true that I think low-skilled migrants do jobs which nobody wants to do. If you look at the one episode that's often studied is the braceros in California. President Kennedy actually banned the Mexican fruit pickers in California. And when that happened, the presumption was that wages would go up for the local fruit pickers. In fact, they didn't. Why did it didn't go? Because mechanization immediately set in. They didn't, once you faced with the fact that you didn't have an easy supply of cheap workers, they immediately mechanized. And so all of those are different reasons why, the low-skilled migrants actually don't necessarily crowd out jobs, because they actually, some jobs only exist because they're there. But when the low-skilled migrants are there, then of course the whole community is better off, because then they earn a wage instead of a machine getting the earnings, and then they spend it.
Right. And so you're saying the flip side equally, that you stop them from coming is also not going to create more jobs, because you may automate at that point. So why the anxiety about immigration?
Well, I think partly it's bad economics. I think it's this idea that, there's a demand curve. Most of us took it in, in college. There's demand curve, it slopes down. You have a supply curve, which is, how many laborers are there. You move the supply curve, and the wage falls. This is, Econ 101. Unfortunately, to analyze something like a large inflow of migrants, you want to do Econ 102. And Econ 102 says you need to think about what happens to demand. These people buy stuff. And somehow I think we've implanted Econ 101 too successfully in the minds of people.
So you're saying there's some hope for macroeconomics also, in addition to microeconomics?
Yes.
Okay. Talk to us about trade. Again, trade is an area where there's so much, misunderstanding. Why do economists fail to persuade about the good, the positives, and the negatives of trade? First, what do you think about trade itself?
Let me answer both of them together. I think it's easy. So I think that the economists live in this world where, first order, they think that if GDP goes up, this goes back to the point, then it's good. And I do think that trade increases GDP. I think all the trade paranoia that, for example, in India we had in 1991, when people just thought if you open up to trade, all jobs would vanish. David Ricardo, in the 200 years ago, gave a good answer to that question. He said, if all the jobs vanish, it's because you're buying stuff for the Chinese. What are you buying them stuff with? You're not earning anything. So he pointed out that they couldn't possibly be that all jobs vanish, because then there would be no money to buy anything from China, and therefore, obviously, that wouldn't happen. And I think that's true, and nothing disastrous happened. The Indian economy took 1 year to recover and started growing faster, or at least as fast, and nothing bad happened. I think so. First order, I think if you take GDP as your outcome, now I have resisted taking GDP, so that's why. And I think the thing we miss as economists is that trade is something where the victims are very concentrated and the beneficiaries are very diffuse. We all benefit from cheaper, phones. Great, but a little bit. Whereas I think the people who get hit by, some particular trade, the furniture factories in North Carolina shutting down, those are a very concentrated group of people. In their towns, there was a furniture industry, then there's nothing. So the victims are very concentrated. The gains are diffuse. And as a result, there isn't really a mechanism for making people whole, because each of us a little bit of gain, we don't really feel that we need to give that up to make these people whole. And so the whole political economy of trade has been one of kind of letting some people take the hit for the benefit of others. So GDP maybe goes up, but a bunch of specific people take a hit. And what's, I think, objectionable about that is that we actually knew who those people are. We know where the trade is going to come in. We could predict who those people are. We could do something for them ahead of time. We could help them. In fact, the US government has a program for it for very many years, from the 60s, called the Trade Adjustment Allowance. And roughly in the highest trade affected districts, that per capita you get about 50 cents from that program. So it's just not implemented. So there is a program, but it's all, nobody's lobbying for it, so nobody benefits from it.
Yeah, I've heard a Secretary of Commerce say it's a joke.
Yes.
It is, because it doesn't really help. First, you have to determine that you were affected by trade, and that's hard in the first place. And second, it's not very substantial. But
the program is substantial, actually, and could be per person, but nobody gets it.
Yeah.
In fact, there's an impact evaluation showing that the few people who get it actually benefit a lot.
Okay.
They are $50,000 net earning as a result of that. Or something.
So, but your view of why trade happens, even though it affects the small groups a lot, is sort of counter to the Mansur Olson view that the small groups have inordinate power. Why don't these small groups have power on the issue of trade? Why aren't we much more protectionist than we actually are? Why are we so much more open, given the power of small groups?
I mean, I'm not a Mansur Olson, God rest his soul, has said it. I don't know that for that reason it's God's truth. I think some small groups are very powerful. Small groups of relatively poor people are not very powerful. I think it's just, there's nothing about, I think what he had in mind were, people who can form an oligopoly or something. I think the, furniture workers in North Carolina, I don't think they just have enough, any great pull on the political economy of the US.
But we're seeing some pushback against trade, right, across the world, from these very small people who have been ignored before. So where do your sympathies lie here?
I guess my sympathies are mostly with, we go into some detail in the book. We were sort of, I think my sympathies are with the victims of this, but I think what they're asking for is in some ways not in their interest. Because I think if you close down trade, what will happen is another set of people will get hurt. Because it's not that, of course there'll be reciprocal. So now the Iowa farmers are getting hurt. So it's not that, it's again targeted groups of people export. Those people will get hurt. It's not that everybody, I'm not really exporting anything as far as I can tell, but like a certain set of Americans export, those are the people who are going to get clobbered when trade is shut. So I think asking for any of these transitions are costly. Given the transitions are costly, let's fix the transition and not create more transitions. So that's why the trade adjustment allowance, in principle, is a very good instrument.
Now, there's a whole range of studies which talk about the effects of the China trade on U.S. towns and communities where entire sort of establishments closed down. Your student did a similar sort of study in India, and do you want to talk a little bit? Petya Toplova, who was my colleague at the IMF. You talk a little bit in the book about her work and the reception it had. You want to talk a little bit about that? Yeah. And why this differential reception?
Well, I think so what Petya did was, what people do, there's lots of studies now. Petya was ahead of her time, maybe too far ahead. In a sense, she wrote a paper showing that areas in India which could be predicted to be more exposed to trade because they were producing the goods that were more affected by tariffs, where tariffs came down more. Those are the places where you see slower reduction in poverty, more increases in child labor, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that was somehow read as saying the trade is bad, and that was not particularly what she said, actually, because she said that, maybe trade is good for the entire GDP goes up, but some people may get benefit less than others. But I think the main point she was making, which is the point we started this conversation with, was that that these effects are concentrated. That when tariffs go away, maybe the rest of the country benefits a little bit, but some people get hurt. There's this same idea that people are sticky. They don't move. They just take it in the neck where they're standing. And that's a fact that she was documenting. I think the trade economists at that point resisted that idea. So, I don't know why, because at some level I think there's no particular reason to assume that people instantly get moved from wherever the jobs are lost to somewhere else. But that was very much the presumption of economics, is that the reason why trade doesn't hurt is that if I lose a job in making furniture, I take a job in selling furniture. Probably not in North Carolina, in the same towns, because nobody's buying furniture there. Those towns are in deep decline, but in New York City. But in fact, those moves don't happen. They don't happen in India. They don't happen in the US. And that's I think that at the core of this is we keep using the word sticky economy in the book. The economy is sticky. Even capital doesn't move very fast, and labor doesn't move very much either. And so everything sort of stays in place. And that's why we need to think about who are the kind of the predictable victims of certain things, because they're not going to move. They're going to be sitting ducks somewhere.
Why is the profession so much more willing to accept these findings today when they're in the context of the US than when they were in the context of India?
I don't know. It's an excellent question. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just generational. Maybe there's a new generation of economists who are more. I think engineering economics has become much more empirical science. So people actually believe the data when it says something, rather than saying that my theory has to beat your data.
Just to conclude our discussion on trade, are trade wars easy to win?
No. I don't even know what win means. I think trade wars, I think the trade war just adds a new set of victims, because you get the people who already lost their imports, which rarely come back. What happens instead is that the exports also go away. Trade wars, I think there's no evidence of a trade war that was ever won by anybody.
Okay. When it comes to growth and development and, in fact, trade, everybody has in mind China and the Chinese miracle. And, of course, one of the factors driving the US-China conflict is a fear in Washington that China will overtake the United States soon, both economically and militarily. And you're a little more sanguine about this. You say, I think precisely, in terms of what is to come, it looks like the United States can relax a bit. Why do you say that?
In 1989, Ezra Vogel was a well-known Harvard Japan specialist, published a book called Japan as Number One, predicting that Japan will soon take over over as the world's richest country and will cross the US, and thus Japan as number one. In 1990, Japan stops growing, and it essentially has stopped growing since. So, I mean, maybe it was Ezra Vogel's curse, but I think mostly it's that, fast growth is very episodic, and I think part of the reason we have a hard time thinking about fast growth is, again, because we think of a world where all resources are kind of efficiently allocated, and then fast growth looks like a miracle. Because, how do you get that much growth? The reason why China could grow so much is that China is a big country with extraordinarily badly run economy till they started liberalizing. So you have lots of resources, lots of well-educated people who are doing nothing, and lots of opportunities that are not being taken advantage of. So the transition is often very good for growth because there's lots of opportunities that are not being exploited. I think China is now out of those opportunities, they're much closer to being out of those opportunities. I think Chinese growth will slow. It has slowed, and the Chinese government knows that. I think the new normal of 6% might turn into the newer normal of 4.5%. But I just think that, and even at 6%, it will take some time to cross the US, and 4.5, obviously much longer. So I'm guessing that growth will slow in China because, I think most countries, that's been the history, that, you get episodes of extremely fast growth. Think of France between 45 and 75. Extremely fast growth, nonstop, and then stops and never resumes, basically. So I think that that's the pattern we've seen. I see no reason why China will be the exception. I think the view that essentially you start from a messed up economy and you, for a while, can grow because there's lots of basically free resources available, because your resources that could be used are not being used very well, creates enormous opportunity for growth. And then that opportunity kind of, once you're using the resources relatively well, then normality kind of takes over, and that's what...
Is your sense also that growth, as they finish that period of transition and get closer to the frontier, is that a different kettle of fish than growth and catch-up?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it is a different kettle of fish, because I think then you really need productivity growth. And the Chinese are very aware of it. They're making huge investments which may or may not pay off in kind of cutting-edge technology, public investments, basically, or publicly sponsored private investments. In China, these things are a little bit mixed up. So there's lots of that happening in China. They're very conscious of it. They really want to get to high productivity growth. And high productivity growth has been elusive for most countries.
Right, and they still have to make up their mind what kind of economy they are, right?
Correct.
Just got back my censored version of my book, and everything that was related to Marx was cut out. They're still communist in that sense. We have so many topics we can talk about that you cover in this book, and I definitely would recommend it to everybody in this room. Let's talk very briefly about two big ones, really big ones. Climate change, what should we do?
This is probably, of all the things in the book, this is the thing I understand the least. I will say, it's most of the things we write, at one point in my life, I've written something about it. This is something I actually never written anything about. So I'll say this, you should take it with the spadeful of salt, but it deserves. But I think that, I still think that it's a matter of despite all the, the kind of the Pollyanna and the prophets of doom, I think there's actually a space for negotiation. I mean, the costs of fixing climate change, if you want to do it, are still my sense of the estimates, that's sort of what we talk a lot about, is that actually, I think it would take a set of regulatory choices. It's not a matter of just, people's goodwill, but I think with those regulatory choices, the options are not as dire as they're made out to be. I think there is some leeway to be exploited. I think if we don't do it, we are going to really have a massive disaster. That I'm convinced of. But I don't know that, maybe that's the saddest part. It's not inevitable, and yet we may end up there.
So you're saying the costs of mitigating, averting, etc., are quite small relative to the potential disaster that could.
Yeah.
But do you have a particular favorite method that you have in mind, or you're more agnostic about that?
I just repeat what other people say. I think this is not, as I said, this is one area where I feel that we should have said something about it, so we said something, but neither of us is an expert.
Okay, I can sympathize with that feeling. So let's talk a little bit about universal basic income. You talk about that in your book. What good thing, bad thing, a thing that's time has come?
Both. I think we talk about it and we actually stick out a position on it. Our position is very much that
you want to just explain what
universal basic income, I suspect everybody in this room knows, is the idea that everybody should be guaranteed an income, something maybe enough to be able to live on or not. What live on means it could mean different things to different people. There's one presidential candidate who's gone to town with it. There is in the UK, the Green Party has embraced it. So it's very much a live idea. I think we take the view that for countries like India, it's a very important idea because India does very poorly in targeting. And targeting is extremely costly. So, in fact, there's lots of poor people who get missed because there are all these schemes for recognizing who's poor and who's not. But as someone who's spent lots of my life studying these targeting process and how to do it better and worse, mostly it's very difficult unless you have good data. Now, in the US, on the other hand, I feel like the real problem we're dealing with is actually predictable, geographically concentrated sort of people who, there are lots of people who, could do with a better life, and I think I don't grudge them that, but I think that if you look at the first order, if you think that there's a certain amount of money to be spent, I think the US, the concentrated losses taken by a bunch of people over the last 40 years is really important to address. So right now, my view is that I think we are better off. Actually, since we know roughly where they are and roughly what's going wrong, we could be maybe more aggressive towards them. And when you do universal, you spread out the same money across more people. And I would have thought in the US, it makes more sense to be targeted.
So universal in a poor country where you don't have much information like India, more targeted
in the US.
US.
Yeah.
And great. So let me ask you two quick questions. One, you probably, I presume as a Nobel Prize winner, you're invited to the White House. What would you tell?
Not yet.
Well, let us say you're invited to the White House. Just like all those sports
yes,
winners.
They don't go either. So.
So if you did go, what would you tell President Trump? As an economist.
Maybe we'll discuss immigration. I have a chapter on it.
Okay. In the current presidential campaign, who do you favor? I presume on the Democratic side.
Yeah, absolutely on the Democratic side. I don't know. I like a lot of what Elizabeth Warren has to say. I'm not sure. I really don't like the idea of focusing on Medicare for all. I think that's something that just doesn't seem to be politically salient. It's like something that I feel like economists came up with this idea that the one missing market in the US is health insurance, and so the government has to do it. I think that if I had to pick something to focus on, I would have picked, what I said, which is geographically focused.
Place-based policies.
Place-based policies for get people out of the deep depression they are in. I mean, just look at the statistics are kind of frightening because you see in the US, the last few years, among the white population, mortality has been growing. People are living less and less. And that's a stunning fact. The last time it happened was during the influenza epidemic of 1919. 100 years ago. That's the last time this happened. So this is a
more pressing problem.
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask the last question, then turn it over to the audience. For the aspiring economists in the audience, how does one become like Abhijit and Esther?
I think that mostly, I would say the only thing I would maybe hold on to is that I've always indulged myself by doing exactly what I wanted to do. And that's a good way to get there. I think is that, either you enjoy it or maybe some people appreciate what you've done. But I'm a deep believer that, I think looking for other people's wisdom on such things is a bad idea. Do what you think is sensible.
So don't listen to you.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, I think we have time for audience questions, and it's over to you.
Yeah, we have about 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, raise your hands and wait for the microphone. You can also submit them online down the front here, please.
Thank you. I actually get my economics from Planet Money and NPR. And I was fascinated when they were talking about modern monetary theory. What do you think about that?
It's way beyond, I'm out of my depth. The modern monetary theory seems like black magic to me, but I'm not enough of a monetary theorist. You should ask him. He's much better.
I think you had the right answer. Whenever economics gives you a free lunch, it's black magic.
On the far side there, thanks.
Hi. Randomized controlled trials have become very popular in Chicago, particularly as it relates to high-risk youth and community-based organizations work. Unfortunately, most of the controls are really polluted because so many organizations are trying to recruit the same youth. So when you think about the work that you're doing at such a large scale, talking about 1 million people in an RCT, how do you really construe the control group? And then could you speak a bit about what is really the ideal condition to run an RCT? Because they're very expensive for, unexpected low outcomes if you can't get a proper control.
So you don't do an RCT with the assumption that you won't get polluted. You do an RCT while measuring how many people in the control group got treated. That's rule number one, is we always measure. Some people in the control group will get treated. Some people in the control group will get microfinance. They'll get whatever the program is, they'll get polluted. You measure, and as long as you measure it, you rescale by the difference. And that's the standard way to deal with it. So I don't think there's any mystery here. I'm not saying anything that's incredibly brilliant or something. It's completely, that's the way to do it, is you measure carefully. And I think the statement that incredibly expensive, I find relative to what? Doing something that makes no sense. It has to be that either you know that what you're doing is right, and it has to be, you already have evidence, and then don't do an RCT. Why would you bother? Or you don't know the answer, in which case, your choice is between doing something that could be completely meaningless, and that's a lot more money, or doing an RCT. This question I don't particularly understand, because I don't say that you should do an RCT every morning, you should just think very hard about why you're doing the RCT, because you're right, it's expensive, but it's very inexpensive relative to the amount of money that gets wasted doing things that have no impact. Eventually somebody does an RCT and you find that it did nothing. There are tons of such programs. So I feel, I think that you could easily tell me that this particular program is great and we don't need an RCT, and I'm not going to argue with you. You may know the answer. But if you don't, then an RCT is quite valuable.
Another question, just to the side there, thanks.
Recently, both of you penned an article on India's economic challenges in Quartz, and you elaborated on the steps that can be taken to address these challenges. A widely discussed input of the economic challenges is the erosion of trust throughout the economy. So far, the government has taken limited fiscal measures to address that, but that hasn't been translated onto the consumer side. So according to both of you, what can be done to build up this trust in a way that passes on to consumer demand?
I think that the consumers are right in being worried. I don't think there is a sense in the Indian economy. I think the government is worried. So I think everybody is a little bit. The government is. The finance minister just said that she's not confident that the economy has turned the corner. So I think it's reasonable to be worried. And if you're worried, then maybe you should be. If you think you're going to lose your job, could lose your job, you may want to be circumspect. Would you have
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Just there, thanks.
Thank you both for being here. My question is if you could both elaborate on some of the potential parallels between both your most recent works. So Dr. Banerjee, various prescriptions to support underserved communities, and Dr. Rajan's assertion that communities have been left out in favor of the other two pillars, the market and the states. They both seem like ideas that would share much in common.
It's not entirely accidental. We've been friends and co-authors for many, many years now. So I feel like this is not it's not coincidental. I think we have we often talk to each other and we work together. So and this particular issue, I'm sure I'm influenced by Raghu. I think it's completely right, and his book is completely right in saying that somehow the framing of the economic problem kind of ignores this third pillar. We just don't seem to have a space for it, in a sense, in the discourse. And it's sort of an accidental third thing that shows up after we have done with all the other things. And that can't be right. I mean, it's clear that at some level, the fact that I think one thing we emphasize in this book a lot is the idea that reason why people don't leave is that they actually care a lot about their connection to the community. That it's like, that's what gives them meaning. You have standing in the community, somebody, even if you're not rich and even if you're not successful by some abstract standard, you're somebody in the community, you have connections, people respect you. All of those things make it very hard to leave and become just somebody else somewhere else. I think that's one of the reasons why people don't leave. So I think that's a very important part of why communities, when the sort of the one factory that provides jobs in the community shuts down, it's a very important reason why the whole place then collapses, because people don't know what to do. They're kind of deer in the headline because they don't really know. They don't want to give up the one thing that in their life they've known and has given them meaning, and so it's a really hard choice that they get thrown.
Any more questions? The very back there. Thanks.
I should say, whose book came out earlier. I read it before we wrote.
This question relates to the idea of universal income. And so with that, what would you propose to be ways for funding that? Where would that funding come from?
Oh, I mean, I think that the U.S. is way undertaxed. We say that in the book. I think relative to other economies of its roughly in the same range, U.S. is it's an incredible outlier in the sense that, most European economies have 45 to 50% of GDP is the government sector size. In the U.S. is closer to 30. So I think there is space. If there is political support for the view that the government needs to do more, I think there is space, fiscal space for it.
At the very front row here, please. Thanks.
Thank you for being here today. This question is related to the escalating costs of the healthcare in the United States. You know, almost everybody living in this country is concerned about the escalating healthcare costs. Now, how much of impact it's going to have over the next decade because of the uncontrolled costs of the healthcare or the general economy of the United States?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. It's I think other people have produced numbers. I don't know. I have not spent enough time looking under the hood of the car to know whether those numbers are to be believed or not. I don't know that it's such a disaster, I mean, especially if the United States is going to be an economy that essentially is not going to be in a lot of manufacturing, which is plausible. Then I don't know. I think healthcare is a great place to create lots of jobs. I don't think of it as being, I mean, partly the world also comes to, you know, rich people all over the world come to the US to get healthcare. It's not accidental. So I'm not sure it's a bad thing for the US to be a service exporter. So I haven't fully understood it, and I can't say I wouldn't take my views on this very seriously. There are people who do know much more about this. My colleague Amy Finkelstein is one of the great experts, my MIT colleague, on this. I'd rather listen to her than listen to me. So.
On the side here, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. If I understood you correctly, there is no evidence that low skill level immigration is a net negative on the country to which people are migrating. If that is true, why is there such perhaps reluctance to explain that on the part of politicians? Or why is it not better, just the information better distributed? Or is the answer something beyond economics, as in identity?
Oh, I think that, I'm sure identity is important. I also think that people have that's what I tried to say. I think people believe Econ 101 a lot. And Econ 101 gives the wrong answer on that question. You need to go to 1 or 2. So I do feel that politicians, and that's partly we wrote the book, we felt that one thing economists do is they kind of act as oracles. They pronounce. And what we're trying to do in this book is to provide explanations, not pronouncements. We try to provide, this is the reason why such and such argument doesn't work, and you have to think beyond it, and here's the next argument and the next argument. That's partly what we try to do in the book, and try to make those accessible. That's sort of what the attempt in the book is to go beyond, we as economists know the truth and here it is, to saying this is the reasoning we go through and this is why we believe this.
One final question from our app here. It says, with Democrats moving towards socialism and Republicans rejecting free trade, is neoliberalism dying in America? Easy one to end with.
Yeah.
What replaces it?
I don't know what it means. I mean, I think that there is a sense in which hopefully we'll have a better capitalism is where it's heading. I'm optimistic, but obviously no one knows.
Well, thank you very much, Abhijit, and I hope you'll all join me in giving him a hand of applause.
Thank you.
If you'd like a copy of the book, if you could line up along the back wall to buy the book and have it signed in front of that TV screen. Thank you.